Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, and its successor, Transport Layer Security, or TLS, are protocols used to provide secure communication over computer networks using a variety of cryptographic techniques. By default, HTTP communication is done in the open. That means anyone can watch your traffic as you communicate with other computers and servers across a network and across the internet. A bad actor could easily steal your passwords and credit card information this way. The first obvious way to prevent this is to use some kind of encryption. In symmetric encryption, you and the server would have the exact same key used to encrypt and decrypt the data. Now you can pass messages back and forth, and the snoop would just see a random string of characters. Something encoded with a modern encryption method like AES-256 might take millions of years to break without the key. But there's a problem with this method. How do you securely share a key with a server, which might be on the other side of the planet? You could visit them in person or call them up, hoping the phone line is secure, but that's incredibly impractical every time you want to visit a website. This is where asymmetric encryption comes in. Here, our server has a public key and a private key. The public key is used for encryption, and it's meant to be shared in plain text. The private key, however, should never be shared, and it's used for decryption and digitally signing messages and certificates, which we will look at later. To handle part of this encryption, the server can send our computer its public key, which we can use to encrypt messages to the server. These messages would be one-way only, but we could at least send sensitive information like passwords and credit card numbers securely. But there's still a nasty vulnerability here. An attacker could impersonate a server that we're trying to connect to. Instead of connecting to the server, we'd unknowingly connect to the attacker's computer. The attacker would generate their own public-private key pair. They would then request the public key from the server and send us their public key instead of the server's. We'd think we received the server's key, so we go ahead and encrypt our data, which is then sent to the attacker. They would then decrypt it with their private key and copy our important data. They then encrypt the data with the server's actual public key before sending the newly encrypted data along. Neither the client nor the server would know anything is wrong. This is known as a man-in-the-middle attack. Note that the encryption scheme is not actually broken. Instead, this is a problem with authentication. We don't know if we can trust the server on the other end of the line. SSL and TLS provide techniques to prevent this kind of attack, as well as create a secure channel using dynamically generated symmetric keys. TLS started off as SSL back in 1993. Netscape Communications developed the first version to help create secure communications between clients and servers across the internet. It had a number of flaws, which is why the public had to wait until version 2.0 was released in 1995. A year later, SSL 3.0 was released and introduced cipher suite negotiation, where the client and server would mutually decide on which algorithms to use for the secure connection. It also introduced message authentication codes, or MACs, which are cryptographic functions that help ensure the integrity of the data and establish the authenticity of the sender. In other words, MACs help detect if a message has been tampered with. In 1999, TLS 1.0 was released, which mostly just offered some minor improvements over SSL 3.0. The big difference here is the name change. The Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, took over maintenance and made it an open standard. In essence, TLS is an evolution of SSL, which is why you will often see the two names used interchangeably. Later in 2006, TLS 1.1 was released that improved the cipher suite negotiation and added better error handling capabilities. A couple of years later, version 1.2 added enhanced encryption and authentication algorithms. Finally, we have TLS 1.3, which came out in 2018. This provided a method for faster handshakes, improved encryption even further, and removed outdated features, especially crypto algorithms that had been compromised. While most versions of SSL and TLS have been deprecated, you can still find some older systems that rely on them. If you are creating a new product, you should consider using the latest TLS version 1.3 and build in ways to update the software or firmware, such as using over-the-air updates. Now, let's look at how TLS helps computers establish a secure connection. One of the key features in SSL and TLS is the idea of a digital certificate. This is a file, usually stored on the server, that is sent over to the client when a connection first happens. The format of this file for SSL and TLS is defined by the X.509 standard, which is maintained by the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU. The certificate contains some necessary information about the server that helps provide proof of authenticity, meaning the server is who it says it is. The important bits of information here are the certificate authority, or CA, that signed the certificate, the common name, or CN, which is often the domain name of the server, like example.com. When the certificate expires, the server's public key, and a digital signature made by the CA. Note that the signature can also sometimes be from an intermediate certificate authority, which creates a chain of trust. A few steps are taken for a server to set up a TLS certificate. It first generates a public-private key pair, where the private key is never shared and to be used for decrypting messages and signing data. Then it generates a certificate signing request, CSR, that contains its public key, common name, usually the domain name like example.com, and usually some organizational details such as the server location. The server creates a digital signature for this CSR by first hashing the CSR text so far using an algorithm like SHA-256. It then encrypts this hash using its private key to create the signature, which allows the certificate authority to verify that the CSR was generated by a system with control over the private key. This might be the same private key we saw earlier if something like RSA is used, but modern TLS implementations might use another more advanced algorithm, like ECDSA, with a separate key. The same key can be used for decrypting messages as well as creating digital signatures from hashes. The CSR is then submitted to a certificate authority, which verifies the domain by, for example, adding a special DNS record, emailing the admin, or looking for a special file placed on the server to prove ownership. Once verified, the CA generates a new TLS certificate containing the website's public key and signs it using the CA's private key. The CA then issues the new certificate to the server, which can now send it to clients that request it as part of a TLS handshake. The final part to consider is that certificates expire. Most CAs grant certificates to servers with a lifespan between a few months and a year. As a result, server administrators often set up scripts or tools that automate the process of obtaining new certificates just before the old ones expire. To establish a secure connection using TLS, a special handshake process must occur between the client and the server. As the TLS handshake is done over TCP, the client and server must first set up a TCP connection using the basic underlying three-way handshake. The client sends the server a SYN, or synchronized packet, to request a connection. The server responds with the SYN-ACK, or synchronized acknowledge packet, and finally the client sends an ACK, or acknowledge packet, which completes the TCP handshake. With the TCP connection in place, the client sends a client hello message to the server, which includes the supported TLS version, usually 1.2 or 1.3 these days, a list of supported encryption algorithms, known as cipher suites, a random number used for key generation, and possibly the session ID, which can help resume a lost session later. The server then responds with a server hello message that includes the TLS version selected from the client's list, the chosen cipher suite, another random number, and the server's digital certificate that we saw earlier. It will quickly follow this up with a server hello done message to indicate that the initial part of the handshake is complete. The client then verifies the certificate in a few steps. It first checks the certificate's chain of trust. In some cases, the server certificate is signed directly by a CA, but in many cases, it is signed by an intermediary with signing authority from the CA. If we trust the CA, we can then trust the intermediate CA, and we can ultimately trust the server certificate. The actual procedure involves first hashing the contents of the certificate, excluding the signature field, using the same algorithm, like SHA-256. The signature value on the certificate is then decrypted using the issuer's public key. If the decrypted value matches the computed hash, the certificate is valid. So how does the client get the CA's public key? If the issuer was an intermediary, the client can find the key in the intermediary's digital certificate, which is usually sent by the server during the handshake. But the client can also download it from the internet if needed. The client then performs the same procedure to verify the authenticity of the intermediary's certificate. In most cases, this will list the root CA as the issuer. There are only a few hundred root CAs on the internet, and of those, only a handful are used by most servers. Most notably, Let's Encrypt, Global Sign, and DigiCert. Because there are only a relatively few root CAs, your computer can easily store all of their digital certificates. In most cases, browsers maintain their own trust stores of these certificates, but operating systems will also have their own caches. Root CA certificates are self-signed and don't expire for 10 or more years. It's important to note that trust is established by the operating system or browser, which means we assume trust for these root certificate authorities, as that's where the chain begins. The client uses the pre-trusted root CA certificate in its local trust store to verify the signature on the intermediate CA certificate, or server certificate if there was no intermediate CA issuer. By verifying the server's certificate using this chain of trust, the client also has established that the certificate is authentic and not been tampered with by something like a man-in-the-middle attack. Then the client verifies that the common name or subject alternative names listed on the certificate match the server's host name it originally contacted, along with the expiration date on the certificate to make sure it's still valid. Certificates may include links to a certificate revocation list, CRL, or online certificate status protocol, OCSP responder. The client should follow these links to make sure that the certificate has not appeared in a revocation list somewhere, which would mean that the certificate has been compromised and should not be trusted. Finally, the client checks the key usage field for digital signature and key encipherment values, and it checks the extended key usage field for TLS web server authentication. By listing these three usages, the certificate effectively allows for a TLS connection between server and client. The TLS handshake is quite involved, but it helps ensure trust in the server, and it sets us up to generate session keys that allow us to communicate securely over an encrypted channel. In TLS 1.2, the client generates a large random number known as a pre-master secret. It then encrypts this number using the server's public RSA key and sends it to the server. The server decrypts the message using its private key. Now that both the client and server have the same pre-master secret number, they use it along with the client random and server random values exchanged earlier in the handshake to derive the final symmetric key. The symmetric key pair is used to encrypt and decrypt messages with the chosen cipher suite, like AES. In addition to sending the pre-master secret, the client also sends along a change cipher spec message, which simply tells the server that it should start using the encrypted channel using the cipher suite they negotiated earlier with the session key they just mutually derived. The client also sends over a finished message that has been encrypted using the chosen method and session key. The server decrypts this message using its own derived session key and verifies the client's message to ensure the keys were computed successfully. Finally, the server sends a similar encrypted finished message that the client decrypts and checks. If both client and server successfully receive and decrypt their finished messages, it verifies that the encrypted channel has been set up and offers assurance of no man-in-the-middle tampering. An encrypted channel is now set up so that both sides can communicate without being understood by a third party, and the client has verified the authenticity of the server. Either side can end the encrypted connection by sending a close notify alert, and the other side must respond with a similar close notify alert. This gracefully terminates the connection and lets both sides know that the session is complete. Once the TLS session has ended, the TCP connection can be closed using the four-way TCP FIN handshake. The side that initiated the termination sends a FIN or finished packet. For our purposes, we'll assume that the client is the one ending the session. The other side then sends an ACK packet to acknowledge the FIN, followed by its own FIN packet. The first side, or client in our case, sends a final ACK packet back, which fully closes the connection. What I showed you was a simplified version of TLS 1.2. I left out a few details, but it hopefully helps you get an idea of how the handshake can set up a secure communication channel between two computers across the internet. Let's look at a few of the notable changes in version 1.3. TLS 1.3 removes the RSA algorithm and replaces it with the more secure elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, or ECDHE. Before the TLS handshake, the client generates a temporary ECDHE public-private key pair. It sends the public key to the server in the initial client hello message. The server does the same and sends its ECDHE public key to the client in the server hello message. ECDHE allows both sides to compute a shared secret value using their private key and the other party's public key. As the server has the client's public key, it can immediately compute the shared secret, which is used to derive the symmetric session key. The server can then send an encrypted finished message to the client as part of its server hello package, which also includes the chosen cipher suite, server certificate, random number, and public key. The client repeats this process using its private key and the newly received server public key to generate a shared secret. It combines this shared secret with the client random and server random to arrive at the same symmetric session key. This is the magic behind ECDHE. Even though the client and server are using different private and public key pairs, notice that the server is using its private key with the client's public key, and the client is using its private key with the server's public key. The math allows both client and server to arrive at the same shared secret and ultimately the same symmetric session key. It can use this key to decrypt the finished message from the server and verify that the encryption and decryption process is working. Finally, the client sends the server an encrypted finished message, which the server decrypts using the session key. By eliminating that final server-to-client message, the handshake process is now a little faster. 1.3 also offers the ability to resume a session if the server and client saved their derived keys from a previous session. They can send encrypted data in their respective hello messages that the recipient can try to decrypt with those keys. This does introduce a potential vulnerability to replay attacks, though. Additionally, TLS 1.3 adds some security features and removes old or compromised algorithms. While 1.3 is gaining more popularity, you can still find 1.2 in use even as it is being slowly phased out. Something you might have noticed is that the focus is on the server authenticating to the client. In some cases, you might want to have clients authenticate to servers, such as on highly secure corporate networks or when securing Internet of Things devices. The TLS handshake process is similar, but there is an additional step where the server requests the client's certificate while sending its own certificate. The client must respond with its certificate, and both sides verify each other's certificates against their trusted certificate authorities using the process we showed earlier. If both certificates are successfully verified, the handshake completes, and encrypted communication can begin. This is known as mutual TLS, or MTLS. Transport layer security is a powerful tool used to help us navigate the internet with assurance that our communications are secure. It ensures that our data is private, that it has not been tampered with, and that the server at the other end is who they say they are. In most cases, this is all happening behind the scenes for us on our browsers, email clients, and messaging apps. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please like and subscribe. I also recommend checking out my other courses and video series on seanhemel.com/courses. I cover a variety of embedded topics such as Internet of Things, Edge AI, FPGAs, real-time operating systems, and PCB layout. Each of these will give you a great head start in that area if you're looking to level up your programming and hardware skills.